So, thanks for inviting me. When I spoke to, this is weird having the two screens. When I spoke to Sagi about potentially speaking here, he emphasized to me that it'd be good just to let everybody know the kinds of things that I do, the topics I'm interested in, some of the methods I use, and not necessarily worry too much about being focused specifically on water elements, although there are water elements to everything that I do. So I might not mention those explicitly, but they will be good fodder for follow-up questions for sure. So in terms of biographical introduction, so I mentioned I'm in the Department of Geography. This is my first semester here. Coming from the National Association of Environmental Synthesis Center, which is a research center NSF funded through University of Maryland. I was a research scientist there for 3.5 years, I think. So you'll see some elements of me being a geographer, and then also my interest in and passion in synthesis. Those both come out here in this talk. Okay, so let me just start by making a statement that is probably obvious to a lot of you in this room, since you're here and interested in these topics. But just to say that humans are now I think it's safe to say they're the dominant force shaping the surface of this planet. And in fact, we now move and transport more sediment than an order of magnitude more sediment than all other natural processes combined. And that landscape transformation is this product of some very complex social dynamics and interactions between individuals and institutions and communities, things that span all the way from the individual all the way to community level, government, national, all the way to global. So the work that I'm going to talk about here is focused on land use and land use change as this key intersection point between human and natural systems, and also to try to explore those interactions both from local all the way up to global scales, and trying to make those connections consistently in my analyses. Let's see. So the cumulative effects of all these local land use changes, I'm showing some examples here of deforestation, urbanization, and appropriation of net primary productivity. All these local changes are becoming globally and regionally pervasive. And so this has a few key implications. So land use being this key intersection, I'll just wait for people. So land use is at the intersection of the sustainability challenge, and that is both a means of food and income production, but it also links people's livelihoods to impacts to biodiversity, water systems, and climate change. So there's this key intersection point. And land use change, of course, is carried out by individuals, whether they be individual people or individual households, whether they be institutions. So those individual decisions have to take into account the environment that's immediately around them, but increasingly those are being influenced by larger scale factors such as regional change, national policy, global trends and markets, those sorts of things. So we have to think about multi-scale decision making. And to account for these two above points, we need to take a systems approach to this, and not only a systems approach that focuses on interactions between human and natural systems, but also one that integrates these cross-scale interactions as well. So I guess this is also a little bit of background in biographical content. Identify sort of as a land systems scientist, and this is a relatively young field, but from the get-go, they're interested in these human-environment interactions and recognize the importance of those interactions and feedbacks. And I'd say it's safe to say it sort of arose around the same time that National Science Foundation started pushing this couple of human natural systems framework. And it's essentially, recognize that there are dynamics within natural systems, and there are dynamics within human systems. Each of those are important to understand, but then there are feedbacks between the two systems that are equally influential and need to be accounted for. And we start to think about these in terms of coupled systems. So then, over time, land system science has matured a bit more. It's starting to become a more integrative and more inclusive discipline, and we've moved from these conceptual frameworks to now thinking about how can we align these different systems, these different land systems across a spectrum of maybe more socially dominated or more ecologically dominated, and then how do we think about transitions in between those systems? There's also an increased recognition that human decision-making is a really important factor, and we need to take it into account when we want to understand how these systems are changing and transitioning from one to another. And a similar consideration then is how do we look across all these different land systems in very different contexts and draw some more general conclusions or theory about how these things are changing. So there's a focus too on generalization and synthesis in land system science. And there's been articulated through a series of publications and sort of leaders of the field that there are several major challenges, but I'm going to touch on two in particular. One is that much of our understanding of these, how land systems change and evolve and the patterns they create is very much still limited at this descriptive or pattern-based understanding. A lot of this comes from the influence and dominance of remote sensing in land system science and our ability to actually observe these patterns of change globally. So some examples, of course, clearing the Amazon forest for soybeans, or some of the characteristic leapfrog development patterns you see associated with urban sprawl. But we're mostly limited still at this pattern-based understanding, so we're not able to get down to the actual causal explanations for why we see these patterns. And this is because human decision-making, of course, this recognition is so important. It's also incredibly difficult to integrate into human environment systems research. And of course, if you want to derive policy, for example, to manage how land systems are changing, you need to understand the actual motivations and decision-making processes people go through. So this has led more to this other challenge is, in cases when we do maybe get to that causal level and really dig into the decision-making processes, they tend to be very case-based or localized explanations, such as linking growing soy demand in China to deforestation in Brazil, or residential home buyers' location preferences for open space and green amenities, that sort of thing. But because, in order to get to that sort of decision-making level and understand that decision-making process, it tends to be very data-intensive and context-dependent. And so we have a hard time comparing explanations across different contexts and drawing any more general conclusions. And again, with an eye towards sort of land system management and policy, we can't really develop policy to be applicable for every specific context. That's just not feasible. So we need some bit more generalized level of knowledge and information in order to derive policy.
One question.
Yes.
So can you actually generalize, or we have to customize? I just always, like the word, like the question mark on the, because that is more like the society based, not the natural system. So we can really hard to generalize, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it is hard. And particularly what you're getting at, the social dynamics tend to be very context dependent.
Right.
And I will make an argument for, so it depends what we mean by generalization.
Yeah.
And there are different levels of generalization. There are some that are so abstract and widely applicable that they actually don't explain much, versus ones that are so context dependent that you're not able to extend it much further than this way. So I'm going to talk about sort of this in between. That's a good question. So taking these two challenges, I'm going to address the first one, this lack of a process-based understanding, by describing how I use a particular methodology called agent-based modeling, which is a process-based modeling approach focused on decision-making processes of agents to try to get at causal explanations of land use change. And then I'm going to combine that with some novel agent-based modeling approaches to try to use the models themselves and the structure of those models as a means for generalization and synthesis. For those who are not familiar with agent-based models, agents can be anything. They are independent problem-solving sets of algorithms. They can be individuals, households, fish, institutions, whatever. And they have adaptive decision-making capabilities. And they interact with the environment and other agents through a set of behavioral rules. And the underlying principle of agent-based models is this: it comes from sort of complex system science and the insight that you can get very complex system-level patterns from very simple individual behaviors. Right? So you get this emergent system-level pattern. And a classic example of this is one of the very early agent-based models was called Boyd's model, and this was trying to recreate this pattern we see of schooling behavior or flocking behavior, like fish or birds or whatever, and doing it with two very simple rules. So each agent had a rule of monitoring the distance to its nearest neighbor, and then the orientation or the polarization to your nearest neighbor. And through those two simple rules, you throw the agents into a simulation environment, they start to interact and they form coherent flocking and schooling behaviors. Of course, now when we start to think about applying this to people and to land systems, it gets much more complicated. You have quite a few more behavioral rules, but the principles are still the same. So I want to talk a little bit about a particular approach that I'm developing, and I'm not going to claim that this is an original name because there are many different things meant by this, but I'm going to talk about it as an agent-based virtual laboratory. And so this is building on some early work from computational social scientists that were in sort of the ground floor of agent-based modeling, where they were essentially trying to grow social dynamics from the bottom up, and were fairly successful. And so I'm going to talk about trying to recreate the patterns of change that we see in land systems as an emergent outcome of sort of first principle object-seeking behaviors of agents. So by that I mean object-seeking, utility maximization, risk aversion, various sort of behavioral decision-making processes. And this is based on an approach that I refer to as building block processes, and I will talk about this in more detail here in the coming slides. But essentially looking at how different elements of decision-making process interact and how they might be different in different contexts to reproduce these sort of emergent land change patterns that we see. Okay, so what are building block processes? So building block processes are these causal mechanisms that are synthesized from either existing socio-ecological theory, or they're things that have been found, for example, in many different case studies to be responsible for the land change that we see. So what I do then is take these causal mechanisms, and they are focused on specific parts of a decision-making process, and then test them out in various combinations in a kind of unusual way of coding these up, and I'll dig into that here in a little bit. But so I'm going to talk about both individual level building block processes, but also group level building block processes. And at the individual level, you can think about this as how individuals make decisions and how individual differences might affect that decision-making process. At the group level, we're talking about sort of rules of the game that influence how individuals interact with one another and with the environment. And these are coded up in a way, in a modular way, so you can turn them on and off experimentally. And you start at sort of a very basic level, so the most generalizable, the simplest versions of these models. You can think of these oftentimes as kind of a null model, this level 1. And then as you go up in level, they get more sophisticated and more case specific. So by being able to experiment with different combinations of these individual building block processes, they're essentially alternative hypotheses of how that decision-making process is playing out and creating the landscape patterns that we see. And so because it's this form of strong inference, we're able to compete these alternative hypotheses against each other. And so for example, I'm going to focus just on what's probably the most intuitive one is the individual objectives that agents are seeking. So we can take, for example, a farmer's choice of crop type and maybe cultivation extent and intensity. So fairly well-studied and straightforward decision process. And we can start with, let's take profit maximization as probably the sort of the simplest decision-making process that we can begin with. And according to neoclassical economics, we can assume perfect information and full rationality in decision making. So you can say, well, this farmer knows all the possible crops they could grow given their climate settings and their soil, and they also know what the optimal allocation of those crops would be in their field, and they probably know the exact amount of fertilizer to apply. Right? And so then that decision making algorithm becomes pretty simple, where it's just this net of possible revenues minus the cost. That's supposed to be a minus. I gotta fix that. So you've got your production times the price, and subtracting out the inputs, right? And so we can say, as a result of that, let's say that this is the field. This is what it looks like, where each of these different colors is a different crop, and that's how we want to orient them, and the extent that we want to plant them. So then we can go up the next level of building block process and get something a little bit more sophisticated. And so you take this initial base decision model and you add this satisficing component. And satisficing is something that recognizes the cost of information in gathering that information. So, this accounts for uncertainty as well in the information. So it might be due to variable prices or variable weather, or simply a farmer having a non-profit maximizing objective, such as for subsistence production. But all those sort of account for why you might depart from this profit maximizing base model. And so we say, all right, there's limited information. Maybe they don't know all the crops that they could plant there, but they know these three. They don't know the optimal amount of fertilizers, so they might over-apply some of that. So we represent that decision-making process again, and we can get a slightly different field configuration and crop type outcome. And so we can keep going, right? So we know there are also social network influences on how farmers make decisions of crop type and extent and intensity. So in this very simplified social network, we've got our farmer here, and he's got 3 immediate neighbors that he talks to, and they all have slightly different variations on that. So he might take that into account and kind of weigh each of those options and then compare it to his own sort of calculus. And yet again, you can come up with a slightly different field configuration. And then we can start to think about some of the top-down influences that we might have on individual decision-making. So there might be things like social norms or cultural preferences for certain types of crops, or allocating a certain amount of labor to that crop. And so you can look across what everyone else is doing, and maybe there is a dominant type. So maybe it's preferentially influencing our example farmer's decision. Another example, of course, are policies and subsidies that might influence the choice of certain crops. And yet again, we can get another field outcome from that. So just from this one building block process and the variations we see across that, you can get 4 different landscape outcomes. But of course, people aren't that simple, as we were saying, right? Pretty messy. So there are other building block processes that also have multiple levels that can interact with this. So for example, one of the sources of satisficing behavior might be risk perception, consideration of risk. So, with the sort of null model, you can say, well, consistent with the perfect knowledge, we know exactly what the risk of a drought is for a given year. But then maybe more realistic is there's some subjective perception based on the farmer's experience over time. Or you can enter into a more sort of cognitive psychological model where you start to account for loss aversion in making those decisions. Or at the third level here, we've got social network influences. Well, there are many kinds of social networks, and there are different influences on decision making. So you could consider the influence from just your immediate neighbors. You could have an aspatial random network in addition to your immediate neighbors, or it could be something more family-based or a kin network, for example. All those could influence social influences on your particular decision. And of course, social norms, there's a ton of research, particularly on common pool resource management, that talks about social norms and their importance. And so you could have, as the base model, a farmer sort of always goes along with the predominant social norm. Or they could actually have some strategic behavior. Or maybe you have a system in which there's a strategic behavior. If it's against the predominating norm, there's some punishment, some taxes or fees or non-reciprocation in the future. So all of these together in different combinations represent alternative hypotheses of how a land system, its observed pattern and change over time might emerge from these different decision-making processes. So a reasonable question would be, how do you manage all this? How do you navigate it, right? So for this, it's me and a variety of different colleagues, so I can't take sole credit for this, but came up with what we're calling hierarchical genetic algorithm. And let me just break this. Anybody familiar with genetic algorithms? What they do? Yeah. See some heads shaking. Okay. So essentially, a genetic algorithm is a way to more efficiently search a parameter space. Right? And so we've got a pretty multi-dimensional problem here where we've got multiple possible combinations of these building up processes, and they also have parameters associated with them and how you implement them. So genetic algorithm starts with a vector of these different values, and these are analogous to genes and the hereditary process. That's why it's called genetic algorithm. So the first two spots in that vector might indicate the different level of building up process that you're going to start with for each of these decision components. And then there's a series of parameters associated with each of those models. And so you generate a number of different vectors that are all different possibilities. Oops, sorry. You execute the model for each of those different combinations, and you compare the model outcomes to some empirical patterns that we've observed. This is a process called pattern-oriented modeling. I won't talk a lot about that, but I would be happy to discuss it for your questions. It's a very good validation method for process-based models. But you essentially pick the combinations that best match. Man, I got quit hitting that. You pick the combinations of parameters and building block processes that best recreate the empirical data that you see. You take those, you essentially create children of them with various modifications. You can also do this additional step of introducing mutations on each of those different values within that vector, and you create a new population to execute again. And then you iterate this process until you've gotten to some agreement between the empirical data and your model outcomes. So that's a computational way of dealing with this search problem, of really finding what this optimal combination of building block processes is going to be for a particular context. So there are some disadvantages for this approach. One is that the models that you come up with are not going to be predictive of any particular place. Because we're keeping this at a fairly generalized level. These models are sort of standard, what we see in the literature. They're theoretically driven, so they're not going to predict land use outcomes precisely in any given place. Although I'll argue later in this talk and mention here that I do think that they're an excellent starting point for building empirical models. So once you've gone through and identified what the most important decision-making factors are, the processes that are interacting with one another, then you can go on to calibrate it to a particular location. But there's also some non-trivial advantage to this too. Is if you have, as is often the case in how people make decisions, multiple competing theories about how people do that, you can implement each of those theories in this framework and directly compete them against one another to see which is more applicable for a different context. They're also much more practical to program, so you're not building these elaborate place-based models that have very specific rules for very specific contexts. Much simpler to program, and the results are much easier to interpret because you're always comparing the results of a model with one additional building block process to a previous model that was just a little simpler. Right? So you can always attribute the improvement in match between the model outcomes and the empirical data. And it also, and maybe this might be one of the biggest ones, is it overcomes a lot of the challenges we have with synthesis, where you've got a lot of these case-based explanations. They're very hard to compare, but you're doing this, in this case, in the same framework with a standardized set of building block processes, and so you can really compare the performance of that model across different study sites or different conditions that you want to apply the model. Okay, so this addresses the first challenge by trying to get at this causal explanation. So we're going from the bottom up and modeling the decision-making process and testing alternative configurations of that process for different locations. And we're also tackling this synthesis challenge because it's moving towards this flexible and broadly applicable simulation framework so that we can do some cross-site comparison and generalization. Also, I'm missing a clock. Okay, good. All right, so I want to talk about a few projects. I'll go into some depth about one that is advancing. It's getting towards the end of this project. It's a hazardous use project, looking at land use and location decision making on the Mid-Atlantic coast in response to multiple hurricanes. I have another project that's just starting. We're doing global synthesis of large-scale land acquisitions, and I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail. And then I just want to barely touch on a project that is still in the works, trying to get it up off the ground, but thinking about some of these food, energy, water system interaction questions with an eye towards a more recent application that we've been talking about. So let's talk first about this coastal hazards project. So the context of this is, I mentioned that we're studying this in the Mid-Atlantic. It's a place where the coastal population continues to grow, and so you have more people, more property in harm's way than hurricanes. And then add to that, you've got a changing hazard regime, potentially. And so this is just increasing uncertainty in what's driving people's location decisions, particularly when you look and compare between how are they deciding to locate in more or less risky areas, what factors are influencing those decisions, and how might we be able to design policies to manage that.
One question.
Yeah.
Like this is very general, sentence, but I think that along the Gulf Shore, like the Orange Beach, they have more house, but there is no increased population because those houses are secondary, not the, actually people who live.
You say the Georgia coast?
Yeah, like the along this, Gulf of Mexico, like, Orange Beach or like the Florida. Those are the more like recreation, like vacation hot, like those. Then like maybe you also like specify the, like more house, but maybe the population is still, and then also the
They're still getting insurance money though.
Yeah, that is the money side, right? But the population is more like related to fertility. When you talk about the growing population, means we're gonna have more chance have more fertilities from the hazard. That's why we really concerned about the increasing population. I think. Yeah,
certainly the value of property in these places is going up. A lot of that is being fueled by the insurance program in the United States. But we are focused particularly in the Mid-Atlantic, where there actually is an increase in population, and it's not second houses. Most of it is primary residential areas, around the sort of Washington, D.C. to New York City corridor and off towards the coast. In New Jersey is a great example of this. Yes, there were a lot of vacation homes that were destroyed, but there were also a lot of private residences who were impacted by Sandy as well. But those populations are growing and becoming more dense over time too. So that's a good clarification that we're particularly looking at these growing areas, population growth areas. Okay. So one of the questions we're asking is how do the short-term responses to these hurricane events potentially lead to location decisions and development dynamics that have long-term consequences for an area's resilience? And particularly in the context of repeated events, which these events may become more severe and or more frequent in the future. And one of the reasons it is so difficult to design policy and manage land use to increase resilience to these storms is you have this factor of people are messy, and you have this reactive decision-making phenomenon. So this is a great quote from Paul Slovic saying, "One reason why natural disasters have garnered attention is the finding that economic agents appear to overreact to the occurrence of new disasters." This is because people they often don't know the actual probability of a natural hazard event that's going to occur. So they're left to operate based on their own beliefs and often a subjective perception of that risk. And that risk perception is not static either, right? It's tied to specific events. It changes over time. So trying to engineer policy to take account for that is pretty difficult. And of course, there's been a lot of work, psychological research about how people think about and perceive risks. But one thing that's been really difficult is how do you tie those risk perceptions and the subjective beliefs to actual landscape outcomes? And one way that happens is through markets, housing markets, land markets. And so risk tends to be capitalized into housing markets by reflecting housing prices, insurance premium prices, although there are various ways that it does not always happen, and price premium doesn't necessarily reflect the actual risk. A lot of heads nodding back there. But there's also this interesting strain of research in economics that finds really mixed empirical evidence for the effects of these storms on markets. So there's a slew of these that find that you get decreasing housing prices immediately following storms. So there was a big meta-analysis done that found about a 2 to 3% decrease in price growth following these events. Some of these are much larger after specific events in specific areas. But at the same time, there's also a strain of literature that finds that waterfront homes in particular, maybe some of these are second homes, they show no change or maybe a long-term increase. That's the premium associated with living close to the coast. Right, so you've got this covariation, this confluence between the appeal of living close to the coast and coast to the close to the coast, and the amenities that it offers, and then of course the exposure to the risk that's associated with that. So, so this leads to the question of when we see these price changes, which we assume are some capitalization of risk into markets, is this an effect of sort of updated risk information? Now people are updating their risk perceptions and behaving accordingly, or is that pull from the sort of preference for coastal amenities going to be stronger? Right? And trying to tease out those different influences on location decisions is really difficult. And I always think it's good to step back and ask, so what? Well, we saw, for example, in New Orleans, there have been many other examples as well, Houston most recently, that when you have these storm events and you're in an area that is prone to a lot of these risks, you can get a depression in housing prices. And this allows greater access by either lower income residents or just more residents in general. And so you increase the exposure to the population of these events. Oftentimes you have a more vulnerable, from a socioeconomic standpoint, more vulnerable population moving in there. And for the example you mentioned with these second homes, these vacation homes, you have a real equity issue where it's those people that are incurring the costs, but it's everyone who's paying the insurance premiums and having to deal with the change in insurance premiums. So trying to tease out what's contributing to these price dynamics is very important. And then the follow-up question is, well, what's the solution? Is it purely economic? Is it a matter of just getting the prices right to deter behavior of locating these places? Or is it something that has to really tackle the risk perception decision-making process and change how we communicate and how people perceive these risks. Reality is probably a mix of both, but this is a key question we're trying to answer with this project. So the approach that we're taking is using this agent-based virtual lab approach, where we're going to test alternative decision models to try to understand what's causing these housing price changes after storms. We're going to test two particular building block processes. One is how people perceive risk. So we'll have the sort of null model is, we assume that people understand the risk perfectly. It's equivalent to the objective physical-based risk. A version of subjective risk perception, which is essentially just a Bayesian updating over time as storm events occur, and then adding a psychological bias, which is time discounting. It's essentially counting more recent events more heavily than past events. And then we'll look at the objective function. We'll start with the expected utility, which is sort of this profit maximization, or I'm sorry, not profit. In this case, it's utility maximization. And then look at another sort of psychology-based theory of salience and see how that compares. Okay, I won't spend too much time on this because it's a massive model and I can really get in the weeds. But the general specifications, we have three types of agents. Residential housing consumers, which are heterogeneous in their incomes, location preferences, and risk tolerances. We have landowners that essentially are forming price expectations for their land and comparing that expectation to the current value, deciding whether or not to sell. And then a developer that connects that land and housing market by facilitating the conversion of undeveloped land into housing and setting prices for housing. Three major state variables that are always updated throughout the simulation. Like I said, we're considering growing areas, population growing areas, so there is a background rate of population growth. There are endogenously updated housing and land prices that are a result of the agent interactions. They're also using historical storm probabilities, like a 30-year record, I think it is, 33-year record maybe, of some of the mid-Atlantic states and randomly generating storm events based on that historical probability. And an environment, this is the model environment where you've got the coast over here, because mid-Atlantic, so Atlantic's over there. An initial area of development. The land is developed into 100-acre undeveloped parcels. Once a developer buys that, they subdivide it into 1-acre lots. And there's a lot of simplification going on here because we're trying to isolate the effects of the decision-making process rather than all the heterogeneity in the housing types, for example. There's a coastal amenity that, again, is very simple. It's highest along the coast and it decays as you move inland. And there's also an expected damage function. Again, highest to the coast, decays as you move in. And this was generated for a 100-year event using the HAZIS model. HAZIS has its own issues, but it was a good starting point. Okay, and so this is how the interactions play out over time. You start with this initial housing stock. Housing stock and housing prices. Consumers see these prices and the location of houses. They calculate their utility for each, and they competitively bid with one another. The highest bidder gets into the house, and that generates updated rents and housing prices. I work with a lot of economists, so I'm going to talk about rents, but what I mean is housing prices. So there are spatially explicit housing prices. Developer sees those, forms expectations for future prices, then goes in the land market, then places bids on land parcels that are undeveloped. The landowner is also forming expectations for future prices, decides whether or not to sell or keep it in the current use. This creates spatially explicit land prices that the developer then takes and calculates the profit maximizing location, and essentially in this it's just location of housing because all the housing we're assuming is the same. And then they set the prices for the next period, and then you iterate over 20 years. And this is one of the changes to this model. So this was an existing model they were studying urban sprawl with. We've adapted it to a coastal region to ask these questions. We also included an event-driven framework. So storms, according to the historic probability, are randomly generated on an annual basis. They then have a certain the cost function I showed you is incurred every time there's a storm. We're assuming the same severity of storm because we're really just interested in the frequency at this juncture. Agents then perceive that storm, they update their risk preferences. If they're existing residents, they can update their risk preference and sort of judge whether or not they want to stay where they are, or they can choose to relocate, either inland or completely out of the region. And new consumers essentially are just keeping track of their new perceived risk and make location decisions following that updated risk. Right. Okay. So I'm not going to dwell too much on these because, again, lots of details. But so the first model, again, is this objective risk perception. So assuming that agents know the exact risk of a storm event each year. The dynamic risk perception is essentially just the expected probability of a storm each year, and it changes over time. Like I said, the first is a Bayesian updating, and this is pulled from existing literature. And then this Bayesian updating plus time discounting is essentially this, where you're just weighting years from the present, where the present information is weighted more heavily than past information. So this has a bit of a forgetting effect. Okay, the utility of housing is calculated using, with the expected utility, it's the standard Cobb-Douglas utility function. Not going to get too much into these, but essentially you have one part of the utility function that says, what do I generate from a house with a given price? It's distance from the central business district, costs of damages and insurance premiums, indicates that there is a storm, and then you do the same when in case there's not a storm. And this is based on whatever that expected probability is. The salience function is a little different. It's psychologically based. So it essentially is based on, it's an extension of prospect theory, which said that people tend to overweight potentially large losses, and that explains some of the loss aversion. Salience extends that to the other side too, and says actually they overweight the most salient option in this case. It could be a big payoff. The intuition from this is fairly straightforward. So let's see, who do I want to pick on? So if I say, I give you two options. You can play a lottery with a relatively small chance of winning, and either you get a zero payoff, or if you win, you get $100. Or I could give you $10 right now, and you walk away. Which would you take?
Probably $10.
Okay, so let's repeat this now. And same lottery, same odds of winning. I could say, well, if you win, you get $200, but if you lose, you get $100. Or I could give you $110 right now, and you walk away. Which one do you take?
I do the lottery then.
Yeah, you do the lottery. And most people would. That's the finding of salience theory, is that it is the salience of the relative payoff is what people tend to gravitate towards. The percent difference there in the payoff was, $10 here, or not the percent, sorry, the absolute difference, $10 and $10. Doesn't matter, but as soon as that payoff becomes salient, then you tend to choose that option. Right? So in this case, we're thinking the chance of a large positive payoff is the chance to live next to high coastal amenities. The chance of a large negative payoff is the event in which you incur a storm damage and you don't have insurance. Right? So we're looking at that decision space through that salience lens. Okay, so this is what the hierarchical genetic algorithm looks like. Each of our level ones, we've got the expected utility. We start with full information. And then we run this genetic algorithm with different combinations of either the salience theory in one of these, or we start to change some of the risk perception. And we're asking the question, can we reproduce those empirical price dynamics that we see following storm events? So I'm filtering a lot of the background for this and some of the results, because one thing about agent-based models is they produce a ton of data. I don't want to overwhelm you with that, so I'll cut to the chase and say that, well, the time weightings tended to perform better than any of the other risk perception models. And so here we've got the expected utility, and here we have the salience. And so what I did is I went through and found every year the storm event occurred, and then I aligned the data up accordingly, so that I'm comparing years before and years after that storm event across all the individual storms. Also divided the landscape up into high, medium, and low damage areas. the high damage area is essentially waterfront property. The medium damage is about 10 rows back, so you still have a water view, but not waterfront. And then the low damage is everywhere else in this case. And what you see is both models, the expected utility and the salience, perform pretty similarly. As after the storm, 1 to 3 years, we see this drop in housing prices, and well, certainly a slowdown in housing prices, but in some cases even a drop in housing prices. And this is equivalent to what we saw from that meta-analysis that was we've seen earlier in the literature. And we see this interesting pattern change in income. So in both models, you get a drop in the average income in the high and medium damage areas, and a shift, a spike in the incomes in the low damage areas. So those that can afford to relocate, in this case, they are relocating. And over time, you see generally a drop in the average income in these high and medium damage areas. So all that, is fairly consistent, at least qualitatively, with what we see in the literature, but not a lot of difference between the two models. So the follow-up question was then, well, a measure of a good process-based model is, can you predict behaviors and patterns for which the model wasn't initially intended? So then we can look at the insurance decision. And there's some empirical work out there that have seen this dramatic increase in the uptake of insurance policies immediately following a big storm event. And that's exactly what you see here. This is the year of the storm. This is the previous policy holding. And afterwards, you see the spike, and it tends to decay over time as the storm event it goes further into the past. So, one thing that we saw from the salience model, just to go back, is you get sort of the same direction of changes, but the salience model seems to be a bit more reactive than the expected utility. So the hypothesis is, since we've got this reactivity, maybe it will capture the short-term increase and sort of longer, slower decay than the expected utility model. And fortunately, that is what we saw. The black line here is the expected utility. The blue is the salience. The expected utility got this huge spike, and this is change in insurance holdings. So you get this spike immediately after the storm. The expected utility, then you get this sort of very quick dissipation of insurance uptake. But the salience model has that more extended tail of the sort of people gradually sort of forgetting and taking up insurance policies less and less. And then when you disaggregate it by those damage areas, you see that it's actually the medium damage areas that tend to be driving this. And again, there's an income sorting thing going on here too, where the high income people are living in the high damage areas, and so they can really absorb the costs and are less likely to react by buying insurance, although some do. Whereas the people living in the medium damage areas tend to be a little lower average income, and so that potential loss from damages is a bit more salient to them, and so they tend to purchase insurance, where the folks in the low damage areas tend not to. So that was a encouraging outcome. We have some qualitative agreement. I'm not going to claim that these are quantitatively realistic at this point because it's still a very simplified, stylized model, but we are at least can say that we're getting some insight into what the major decision-making processes are that are going on that might be responsible for these empirical price dynamics. And because we've done this at the process-based level, we've got some insight into what, how risk perception is playing a role, how that leads to some income sorting, and how that interacts with amenity preferences, particularly after storm events and then over time. And as I said earlier, and this is really think the next step is now this is a really solid place to go and build an empirically grounded model for a particular location, because we've got some sense that we have confidence that these are realistic decision-making processes that are going on. We're able to recreate some of the stuff we see in the literature, and now we want to dig into a specific location. Okay, let's see, how am I doing on time? Ooh, running out of time. Okay. So I will touch on these last two very, very briefly. In fact, I will kind of gloss over the motivation for these, but so another part of this, what I said in the beginning is I'm interested in these cross-scale interactions. And in this first project, there is this interaction between a regional or state level or national level policy and insurance programs and how individuals then react to that. But I'm also interested more broadly in how global commodity markets are changing how people make land use decisions in agricultural areas and rural areas in particular. And I'll just move through these. And so one of these projects is a NASA project that is just getting started, looking at this idea of large-scale land acquisition. So about 2008, 2009, a lot of things happened in the global economy. There was, of course, a financial crisis, but there was also a pretty severe spike in food prices. And a phenomenon we saw was a lot of wealthy countries going into less wealthy or poor countries and buying up very large tracts of land to try to secure, for a number of reasons. Mining, forestry, there's a large water grab idea that's going on here. It's because there were a lot of Gulf states, for example, that were buying up land to grow crops, essentially using the water there locally to grow crops and send it back to Gulf states. So this was a global phenomenon, and it started to tail off, although there are signs that it's maybe picking up again. But so there's been research on different elements of this. So, what makes a particular country more appealing for this? Some remote sensing work that's tracked the actual extent of these changes. Some other empirical case study work that's looking at particular deals and how land change might occur. And then there's another crop of case study literature in particular that's looking at the consequences of each of these deals and trying to draw some conclusions to that. So this project is actually trying to connect all the pieces, right? And test some hypotheses of, is there this so-called Goldilocks effect of particular countries? So countries that have extremely poor governance, subject to high levels of conflict, are obviously not very attractive for international investors. Countries that have very strong land governance systems are also not so attractive to these investors. So there's this sort of sweet spot in the middle. And so we want to test this empirically and see if that's the case. But also the idea is we're going to use two different synthesis methods. One in which we're going to merge the remote sensing of exactly when and where land change occurred with these deals or not, and try to line that up then with sort of a series of events and changes in local socioeconomic conditions, environmental conditions, but also some of the larger global commodity changes. And then line those up with some of the particular localized effects or consequences of those. And in particular, interested in this idea of indirect land use change. So when you drop down these very large industrial agricultural plots in somewhere that was formerly a smallholder sort of subsistence-based agricultural network, agricultural system, you tend to have a couple different responses. You can have people, of course, just leaving. You can have people that are being hired by that new agricultural operation. Or in the case that we're most interested in, you can push people off that land and into very marginal land. They start to clear more forests and try to grow, essentially try to do what they were doing on worse land than they were on previously. So that has all sorts of livelihood sustainability implications, food security issues, but also it can really accelerate deforestation in these areas too. So I could speak much more about that, but I'm going to just kind of move on at this point. So this is an example of some of the things we're looking at. So 2009, this is in Cambodia. We have some information on where these specific deals occurred, what their intent was, who the major investor is, the intended extent. But we often don't know the exact location because they're not very transparent about that for obvious reasons. But some of the remote sensing techniques, some of these pop out very clearly. This is obviously one of these examples where there was a lot of forest was cleared for this particular deal. This actually might be 4 from the same company. So we're going to be linking that with some of the spatial statistical analysis, but also synthesis of case studies to try to piece together these trajectories of change and the potential consequences they lead to. Just showing some of the NDVI signatures that you can pick up with these time series analyses. The way I want to apply some of the agent-based modeling is, can we look at, this indirect land use change is a really important question, but it's also really hard to analyze. It's really hard to spot on remote sensing. It's, you get anecdotal evidence in the case studies, but nothing really systematic. So can we apply these models then of sort of the existing land users, and then you introduce this large-scale land acquisition and try to run this model and maybe predict where you might see indirect land use change, and then point the remote sensing methods towards there and see if we can actually detect it. That's a very brief version of what we're going to try to do, but since I'm running out of time. Okay, and then I'll just very briefly mention this one too. So this is some food, energy, water nexus work that we're doing, and again, this is trying to trace those cross-scale interactions, right, and their influences on land use decision making, particularly looking at changes in agricultural commodity markets and how that might influence local land users and their crop choices, their land use choices. You could have multiple different pathways, right? So, an increase in commodity prices can lead to either extensification or intensification, and these have all various different land use, energy consumption, and water consumption implications. And you can imagine within a single region, you can get a very wide range of responses. Some work that we're talking about right now, at least. So you could envision this too as a changing water management policy, for example, that's issued at, for example, the state level, and then look at the various responses you might get at the local level of water users, and depending on their local circumstances, their particular attributes, you can imagine a very wide range of responses that have very different water consumption implications. And I will move through that. So, and again, this modeling framework can be applied across multiple different locations to then test out what are the various decision processes and how do they differ across different biophysical social settings, for example, and act as a basis for synthesis. Okay, sorry so much to be speeding up right here towards the end, but some just major takeaways is that land use is this sort of key intersection point between human and social systems, and as such, I think it's a good way to understand and study feedback. And in order to understand how these coupled human natural systems are going to change and evolve over time, you need to understand how people are making decisions. What are the motivations? What are the factors that create differences in decision outcomes for a given context? And of course, land use decisions are increasingly driven by larger scale influences as well as the local conditions, be it policy or global markets. That's becoming a clear trend. And something that I find is true in all these contexts is whenever you change land uses, you also are shuffling around winners and losers. There's always going to be winners and losers when you change how people are using land. And the nice thing about agent-based modeling is that you can actually ask some of those distributional questions because you're considering all the heterogeneity in that decision-making process and all the agent attributes. And I am proposing that this model-based synthesis is a way to get at the decision-making level of analysis while also maintaining some standardization that can enable some of this generalization and synthesis across different contexts. So sorry for the mouthful in the last 10 minutes, but I'll stop there and take questions.
I have two questions. Can you go back to the slide where you talked about your model first?
The coastal model?
The model-based, there was a slide when you talked about the advantages and challenges of the agent-based model.
You want this slide? Or the
you have like a few bullet points where you said like
the advantages, disadvantages?
Yeah.
That one?
Not really,
Is it the farmers one? The one with the farmers?
No, not with the farmer. It was a little bit afterwards. After you talked about your agent-based model. Okay, so you said that maybe it's complex. It maybe gives you like a local minimum and so forth. But anyhow, so let me ask you the following. So we live in the age of big data and all this computing power that we have. So why bothering coming up with a model where you can just basically take all the data that you have, you run them through a neural network, and the network will tell you what the best model is, and it will also tell you what's the best prediction forest at the same time, or action forest.
Yeah, it tells you what factors are associated with a particular outcome. It tells you where those factors might be associated with a particular outcome, but it doesn't tell you how or why people are making those decisions or why they're behaving the way they do. And when, for example, when we're thinking about changing hazard regimes or changing policy or thinking about policy options, you're essentially changing the rules of the game.
Now I remember when you introduced the genetic algorithm for the first time, it was one slide afterwards. You can go there. You had like a hierarchical genetic algorithm.
Yeah.
So one slide afterwards. Not prior, but after.
Exactly.
Maybe two.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that the point still remains though that so this is very akin to a neural network approach, genetic algorithms, same sort of evolutionary programming that's involved, and it helps me sort through these different model structures. But the structures are informed by theory, and they're trying to get at how people are making decisions. And if you want to understand how people are going to react to changing conditions, those that might not be observed in the data that's collected that's applied in a neural network, then you need to understand the decision-making process, how people are weighing different options and can adapt over time. That's something that big data approaches can't get you.
I mean, I think the challenge that you'll be facing there is how to select the right features. But then, the network itself, you have like multiple layers. We'll be able to abstract for you these features that matter. Okay, so like, I work in the area of imaging, but people use this there all the time. So if you will use this like deep neural network approach where you have multiple layers of neurons that are learning, you would see like that the different levels of the hierarchy, the network is abstracting features that matter for you. So like on the beginning, these features look more or less like smaller images of the data that you're passing. But later on, they look like features that like our human visual system identifies. Like edges, objects, shadows, and so forth. So I understand maybe it will be challenging to map that to your own context, but like if you actually have enough of these layers and enough data, the network will take care of everything for you.
Well,
and it will
I
give you
will
some
beg to differ
insights.
there, but we can't. I did present this as starting from scratch, blank slate, higher genetic algorithm. In fact, a lot of these methods though can help put some weighting on some of those transition probabilities and help you get to that solution faster.
Yeah, you can maybe use this as a warm start for your network.
Yes. Yes. In fact, doing some of that stuff now.
Yeah. So I have just one more question because I have to run. So like there is this like competing theory in economics now of humans not acting as rational agents.
Yep.
But in your models, you assume you always act rational, right? You want to maximize profit.
Just the base models, yeah. Just the starting point. And in fact, using them as a null model.
Well, actually, I have a comment on that as well, because I'm just wondering how you factor in the cultural component, because like you mentioned, New Orleans, for example, and some of these Gulf Coast areas that were impacted, there are certain areas, especially New Orleans, where people will never move. They'll stay there until they die.
Yeah.
I mean, other areas like volcanic areas in Italy, for example, these people have been interviewed. They've lived there for generations and generations. They know the risk, but they're going to stay.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into your model as an input?
Yeah, so great question. There's absolutely this factor. I'll answer and say there was a very significant diaspora after Katrina in New Orleans, and so that population has completely changed. But you're right, there are people that have still remained there. The paper I cited there, we've gone into much more detail than I can talk about here of all the various building block processes that you could implement, and certainly these cultural factors. So, there are even competing theories about what that means, right? So, is it a sort of sense of place, a sense of identity that's associated with that place? Is it a lack of information or social network connections elsewhere to actually know where to go? So there's multiple explanations for that. They could be individual level, cognitive, psychological biases, cultural preferences, or they could be these larger group level, society level things. Am I like in the?
I think
It
turn up
just
the
does
mic.
that.
I think.
I think if you so one of my follow-up questions is what time scale are you interested in? Because you showed the data for the housing price drop in Katrina, after Katrina, for example. But now, like if I were to try to buy into my old neighborhood where lots after Katrina were like $10,000, now I couldn't even afford to move in.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking $400,000 homes.
Yeah. It's
Where
amazing how
they
people
used to
forget.
be like $100,000 homes.
Yeah.
So in the long term, you actually see, yes, you have this drop, but then you have a spike, and maybe that's not just, you know, these factors that you're talking about, which are very logical and, you know, make sense, you know, with the housing markets and so forth, but you also have this cultural influence that, you know, people start to get this sense of place, and it actually attracts more people to an area.
So, it's a great question. I got a couple, there's a multi-layered question. So, the time step that I'm on is annual here, and you're absolutely right that there are these longer term dynamics. Some of the insurance uptake dynamics that we saw, you know, they have this 5, 8, 10-year decay in the insurance uptake. And, you know, and one thing that I think this was able to at least give us some good hints at is that the expected utility framework just doesn't pick that up. It's too, you know, the assumption of perfect information is too strong there because they adjust really quickly afterwards. Whereas that salience piece, you still have this risk aversion piece that delays that, you know, sort of extends that psychological bias. But eventually it did kind of go back to the way it was. And I'm only modeling 20 years here because I feel like there's so much other stuff that can happen in 20 years that can change, that can really influence how these things play out, that I don't feel real comfortable going past 20 years. But this particular question is a good one, and you know, it would probably take a slightly different modeling approach, trying to capture maybe some of the larger macroeconomic things that are going on in order to get that. But the cultural preference piece is fascinating, and you know, playing around a little bit with some of the possible building blocks to represent that. Because, like I said, I don't think it's one thing, and trying to unpack it is part of the challenge. Yeah.
Did you actually done any like the sensitivity of your model to the different level of the like individual, like, because one of the thing is your assumption is full information. But if we don't have some information and then we don't know the probability, then the sensitivity to in your model actually, can you actually test out? Because that is also tells you like what is the relatively important, like to make the compute your result. So then like now your result is showing that everyone knows the exact probability, but someone maybe we don't have that much good quality of information, like in the developing country, then maybe like that they have showing different responsible like the utility model or selling.
Yeah. So there's two sources of sensitivity and variation in the model produced. One, what you're getting at is a structural source, and the alternative model versions, the different levels of building block processes, are implementing those differences, right? So the null model, the starting model, is a full information.
Right.
But then the next level up is relaxing that assumption and a more boundedly rational approach.
Right.
And then you introduce some biases, some cognitive bias to that. So those different levels are accounting for that variation from structural changes. We've also done some sensitivity analysis, and I didn't want to totally bore this audience with those results because they're really dense and technical, but using some global sensitivity analysis approaches, where you can sort of systematically search the global parameter space to see, to partition the model variance across various parameter interactions, as well as attribute to single parameters. So that's more of the, if you think of the hierarchical genetic algorithm, where you've got the first part of it is the actual structural piece, the building block process level, and then there's a series of free parameters that are associated with that.
Different scale. social, individual or social?
What? No. So here's the one I'm referring to. So this piece. So there's a whole bunch of parameters. They're going to vary for each of these different functions, and that's where the global sensitivity analysis can come in and tell you how sensitive. Because a lot of these are going to be uncertain. You might pull them for literature, you might specify a range, but can actually quantify how much that model is going to vary based on those. Whereas the building block processes, these are things we're experimentally varying. So we expect to see different outcomes as that building block process level changes, whether it's individual or group. And in fact, that difference is where we get the inferential power, because you've got one simple model, you change one building block process level and see how the outcome differs, and that different bit of explanation you get is the addition of that building block process.
Yeah, because one of the comment is recent, like California wildfire. Usually people have really good information when they start, but the fire actually destroyed the connection. Like there is no cell phone connection, so there is no information.
Right.
That's why the area actually extend pretty quickly. So those you can test. Like I like your approach, process based, because we can test them. Like someone actually say the big data actually can do some better job. But I think that what you're approaching is how and why, right? Understand physical basis.
Yeah,
So like
exactly.
I think that you can test whether we still have full connection or no connection. Then how people behavior are going to be changed
Right.
during the wildfire. Right.
Exactly.
I just have a quick comment. The guy left. I just want to follow up the question. Actually, he mentioned whiteboarder use instead of using neural network. Actually, my understanding, your model is very complex and should already include a lot of modules like something like machine learning. The agent can interact with each other.
Yeah.
So not necessarily neural network, the guy mentioned. Actually, I did 6 years development with the neural network, so I know that well. But actually, my understanding, you already have the Bayesian probability.
Yeah.
It's something similar to it.
Yeah, that's used to update the risk perception.
Yeah.
But even at a finer level, all the agents have learning models associated with them. So, I talked about price expectations. So they're essentially observing past prices. They have a suite of prediction methods they use, and they essentially compete those against one another and select the most successful one. So it's a bit of a evolutionary reinforcement learning kind of model that's going on in the background for each of these agents. Yeah, I mean, I even know agent-based models that use neural networks as agents learning models. So it can get very complex and very close to AI the further down you want to go. But
Is there any interaction between the agents, like message passing between the agents?
Good question. In this particular model, no. It's indirect. It's through markets in this case. So the price information is that's how agents are observing what others are doing. Although I take that back, actually. When consumers are bidding on houses, they actually can observe how many other consumers are bidding, and so they can judge how competitive they need to make their bid relative to how many houses they're looking at. So if they're looking at 3 houses and they've got 5 people bidding on each of those, and they have to up their bid, and vice versa. So there is that bit of interaction, but direct message passing, no, not in this one. Yeah.
So I have a question. So I understand this is probably more applicable to smaller scale, but we have to make some decisions on global scale, say climate change. Do you see this model being upscaled?
Oh yes, yes. I'm glad you asked that question. Let me just put this up because I actually didn't get to kind of whiz through these a little bit. So I've actually been thinking a lot about this. written a couple of proposals that didn't get funded, but we're still trying to actually, we want to compare these to integrated assessment models and the outcomes that you can get. Are you familiar with integrated assessment models? So these are, this is what a lot of the current climate projection models use as sort of the socioeconomic land use component. And they're big macroeconomic, there's some global demand for X commodity, and it gets allocated to this large world region, and then we kind of shift things around. It's great because it works really well with climate models. It's very coarse scale, it's global, but it doesn't really capture land use very well, very realistically. So the idea would be, take this as a world region, and you've got some variation in, say those are precipitation gradients or land cover, forest cover gradients or whatever. You implement this in a stratified sampling approach, where you have, you sample that entire area, you apply it to localized areas, and you're able to synthesize by comparing the different outcomes across various model implementations within each of those strata to come up with more of a sort of average outcome for that strata. And then you essentially piece it back together statistically and say this is the likely outcome for this larger region, given the weighting of representation of each of these strata throughout the region. And the idea of those projects was let's apply the integrated assessment model and this agent-based modeling approach to the same locations and compare what outcomes we get. Because sometimes I'm sure the integrated assessment models are fine. They do just fine. But when there's this potential for adaptation and sort of emergent patterns, then I'd like to see how the ABMs do in that case.
And also, I think it's a matter of like the time you're running the model. You say you're running the model for 20 years. When you go large scale, you might want to scale the time.
Although, one could argue.
That would make it more complicated, so you have to find a balance between the two.
One could argue, though, if you want to model a social system for 500 years, you got to make some pretty significant simplifications about what's changing, right?
Well, and so one of the key unknowns here is the government inputs into these models, especially over those kinds of times, the 40-year time scales. But, so a lot of areas like Houston, Galveston area, for example, they're developing geohazards maps and finally updating flooding maps as of this week. And so those are some unknowns that now, because of these, really big impact natural disasters, people are starting to be aware of that they were out of date and maybe they should be, looking at the flood maps before they buy a house, or making sure that the flood maps are realistic, or in some cases, I know people that generate their own flood maps.
Okay.
So, how does that actually play, or how do you foresee that playing into these kinds of models over these time scales? If governments are actually, taking more responsibility, the Army Corps of Engineers actually updating their maps and making it available to the public so that they can, wield that information when doing a risk assessment and buying a house, for example.
Yeah. So when you say these models, do you mean the age-based model?
Yes.
Or do you mean, it's an excellent question, and it's really hard to answer, and that is kind of one of the frontiers, I think, of agent-based modeling right now is how do you represent government agents? Because they don't make decisions the same way individuals do, and we have far less theory in understanding how governments make decisions. And it's a really sort of chaotic process in a lot of ways. Current case in point. So, there are various ways people are trying to tackle this, and a lot of it is just in the beginning. And I've worked on some models before where we tried to endogenously model policy and doing it through sort of a democratic process where there are agents that are essentially like representatives that represent a whole contingent of people. Those people vote based on their perception of performance, and then that representative interacts with other representatives. And so you've got kind of a two-tier age-based model, and then the resulting outcome at the third level is policy. It's hard though. I mean, because right now it's how do you go and test this to see if it's realistic, and that's not my area. That's why we need political ecologists in general. Yeah.
As far as like public consuming these maps from a photographer perspective, which part of the hierarchical, like, would you put that as a utility, like as expected utility, or as risk perception? Because like there are different ways to present these maps in a more holistic view.
Flood map.
Right. Because I mean, there's lots of literature that says the dichotomy of these maps influence how people choose where they live or voluntarily participate in the NFIP. And so would there be a way to have that be a factor in the decision, like the visualization of the map itself based on actual flood risk?
Well, there's quite a lot of bit of research about communicating, for example, climate risk. Not necessarily so much flood risk that I'm aware of, but climate risk and how, yeah, exactly, the representation of geography on those maps, how it influences the way people perceive it. But then there are all these other sociological issues too, of like, do they actually trust the people they're talking to? Do they, are they getting other information from their neighbors, and do they weight that more than these maps? And so I don't think you can't really consider the maps just in isolation. You're gonna have to consider the social context in which it is being presented and consumed. In terms of like how this might connect there, I mean, if you can pinpoint the there is this subjective risk perception process that's shaped by people's experiences over time. Maybe you can add some historical elements to that to say, actually objectively, the historical risk has been this way. 100-year floodplain doesn't really mean much, right?
Well, that's the other thing on the climate change part, right? 500-year floods are no longer really 500-year
Right,
floods.
right.
So.
Yeah. And that number, yeah, I mean, I don't know what you do with that number because it's not very helpful. In fact, it's misleading in this case. But.
Any other questions? Actually, Dr. Manu.